Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Um, on behalf of the Donia Human Rights Center at the University of Michigan, I'd like to welcome you to our in-person and Zoom audience for today's event, a discussion on disability justice, human rights, and the politics of space. This event is co-sponsored by the Center, the University of Michigan Initiative on Disability Studies, and DISCO Network, which is in the Digital Studies Institute. My name is Robert Adams. I'm an associate professor of architecture and also the director of UMinds, which is the Initiative on Disability Studies. And I have the pleasure of moderating the discussion today, which means I'm going to try to stay out of the way as much as possible, because I think there's some really good people here that have a lot of meaningful and important things to say. I'm a white male wearing a blue shirt and glasses. I use he, him pronouns or none. I identify as disabled. And it's great to be among CRIP comrades, as I'd like to say, in your collective positive energy today. Before introducing our speakers, I would just want to point out a few things, as is the custom of our people. So we're in a room that has the room is actually super amazing. There's kind of stations, pods with microphones and screens all over the place. There's 2 exits in the back of the room. The building exits, if you go out this corridor and then go to either direction on the right and left, that's the exit for the building. There's restrooms, gender inclusive restrooms that are down the corridor, out the doors to the left and around the corner. So feel free to, make yourself as comfortable as possible. There's communication access, real-time translation, or CART services being provided. Thank you so much for that. Yes. Disappeared. So hopefully they're here. But you can also ask to activate the Zoom transcription if you prefer that modality. So let's get into it. Sit back, relax. I think we're in for a really amazing discussion. So the structure of it, I've asked the 4 speakers to essentially give a somewhat short overview of where they're coming from and the work that they're doing. And then we'll get into a more informal conversation around questions that you all have and questions from our Zoom audience. A couple of quick announcements. So coming up here at the center, on November 30th, it's the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 75, subtitle, A Time to Celebrate or to Mourn. I think that's a really important question, and that's being moderated by the director of the center, Stephen Ratner. And then secondly, our friends at DISCO and the Digital Accessible Futures Lab have a call for submissions for creative work. So that's creative writing, artwork, other kinds of modalities that can be submitted for a curated exhibition. And that exhibition will be online and also in space somewhere. David Edelman?
So it's definitely a lot, and we have other iterations at some point.
Yeah. Excellent. Good. Thank you. And DISCO, if you don't know, it's digital inquiry, speculation, collaboration, optimism. And also disco, like 70s style. I want to say a huge thanks to Darian Yasin. Thank you so much for organizing this, for managing the process. You've been completely, your expertise in sort of managing things has been so helpful to make it really flow. So really appreciate your effort. Thank you so much. The land we occupy here is sacred. So the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. That includes many tribes in the state of Michigan, including the Saginaw Chippewa tribe in Mount Pleasant. The Ann Arbor campus currently resides on land ceded through the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. Additionally, in 1817, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan, ceded through the Treaty of Fort Meigs, with the hope that their children could be educated. And we are working on that mission. We acknowledge the sovereignty of tribal lands and the painful history of genocide, forced assimilation and displacement of Native communities that facilitated the establishment of this university. We affirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to the land, the profound contributions of Native Americans to this institution, and the university's commitment to educate children of Native ancestors. So, our speakers today on the far end of the table to my right, if I were facing you, is Iman Rimawi Doster, who is Executive Director, Diversity Includes Disability, an amazing activist, author, poet, and spoken word artist who will speak a little bit about your work in disability justice and activism. Crystal Lee, welcome, is assistant professor, newly minted assistant professor at computational media and design at MIT. Also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Laura Guidry Grimes, welcome Laura, is a bioethicist at the Cleveland Clinic and a clinical assistant professor of medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine, and also at clinical assistant professor of bioethics at Case Western University. So you'll speak a little bit about disability justice and bioethics. And then Lydia XZ Brown, who is here in spirit right now, I think they're on their way shortly, is Director of Public Policy at the National Disability Institute, Executive Director and founder of the Autistic People of Color Fund, and numerous other things that they participate in terms of leveraging debates and working on policy measures through their teaching at Georgetown University. So with that, we've crafted a series of questions. So I'll preview the questions first, and then people will talk about their work, and then we can go through the 4 presentations, and then maybe loop back to questions, as we feel comfortable in so doing. So Iman, it's so good to meet you. I'm so glad you're here. So like disability culture, the concept of disability justice is evolving and it means many things to different kinds of groups, right? So I know through your advocacy, you focus on the right to employment for people with disabilities, amongst other things. And so I'm interested in how do you understand, that term disability justice, writ large. And then another, questions about, what is something that when we were talking about this a little bit before we met, what is something we can do to break down the silos within the disability community, disabled community? I mean, there's lots of different people in that space from representing a whole range of perspectives and so on. So thinking about that. And then I love your question, how does white supremacy culture disrupt and derail the disability justice movement? And conversely, how does disability justice disrupt white supremacy? So thinking about allyship, would love to know more about your work as a creative person, in that space. So yeah, here is the clicker. And maybe just before you start, Iman, this is Lydia.
Hello.
Glad you could make it. I just introduced you, so.
Oh, I don't understand that there was more than one cream on this podcast.
Right. You made it. Great. Glad you're here.
Is this working? Okay, perfect. So that was a massive question. Well, let's start off by saying explaining what is disability justice and what makes it different from disability rights, which I think are both key to improving the lives of folks with disabilities, not just in the United States, but around the world. So disability rights very much focuses on the legal aspect, but also very much leans into respectability politics, which I friggin' hate. Because what respectability politics does is basically strip away some of the heat and fire that comes with disability justice, which is let me use my body to disrupt traffic. let me lay on a federal building. Let me lay there for a month and see what you're going to do about that, which is closer to the justice part than the rights part. But oftentimes in the movement, people want to focus solely on the rights, disability rights, because they want to work with elected officials, which I think is amazing. And I've done that plenty of times in New York City and New York State, working with legislators. Unfortunately, though, when tackling disability and having rights in the whole spectrum of disability, whatever it means, folks sort of, in my opinion, they lose the plot a little bit. They get very focused on either just one disability or one particular movement and think that encapsulates everything. And it doesn't. Its disability is a lot more nuanced and a lot more diverse than just saying, oh, people need access to healthcare. Yeah, we do need access to healthcare, but also accessible and affordable housing and accessible jobs that are not just a placeholder for tokenization, which often happens, or, access to education that's a decent education and not just some, like a sort of, I guess, half-assed version of it and the like. So when we're talking about disability justice, I mean, and also like a lot of folks don't realize that like the Black Panther Party was very much involved in disability justice back in the day. And there were a lot of folks that were in the Black Panthers who had disabilities who were part of the actions. Unfortunately, there were a lot of white folks with disabilities who were racist towards the Black Panther folks, which people don't like to talk about. I did a whole study on it. I was studying disability rights and disability justice. And the deeper I went into my research, the more I found out that a lot of folks from the movement in the 60s and 70s were racist as hell, and nobody wanted to talk about it. And so my paper shifted when I saw what was before me, which was that the white folks in charge didn't want to give any credit to the Black Panthers with disabilities who were involved in, the Rehabilitation Act, in the ADA getting passed. They didn't want to even acknowledge that they were part of that. And unfortunately, that's very, very, that's still very much there. And that's why I was very curious when I was speaking to Robert about bringing up white supremacy and how it affects disability justice, because our mere existence disrupts white supremacy. And then if you go a step further and saying, well, and I'll use myself as an example, and I'm Black, I'm Palestinian, I'm a woman, I'm disabled, and I, basically disrupt their whole idea of what, a successful woman is supposed to look like, or someone who's, 40 years old and what they should be having happen in their life or not happen in their life. Or for the matter that I'm married to a non-disabled white guy, which probably blows their mind. And the point of, and existence is resistance is also a wonderful phrase held by a lot of Palestinian folks who are fighting for our freedom, which I appreciate them creating it, but it very much applies to folks with disabilities, because our very existence, spits in the face of what it means and what it looks like to be a human being functioning in the world, functioning in society, even though society and the world was not designed for us, does not want us to exist in the world, out in the community. And that's very much connected to the way white supremacy is connected to, eugenics and, disrupting diversity and disrupting anything that is different from whatever the quote norm is. But for 26 years, which is probably, longer than some of y'all have been here, which I love, it's fine. I've been organizing in the community, and I have noticed that some folks are down with organizing in a radical way until you mention disability. And that came to that was even louder when COVID hit, and how people didn't want to make things accessible to everyone because they're like, oh, it's not my problem. Well, 3 years in, some people are like, oh, wait, it is my problem because now I have long COVID because I didn't care all this time. And so we're finding more things that are a bit more accessible. Unfortunately, there are some folks who are claim to be left leaning who aren't, who don't really care about making things accessible. And I often say, like, yeah, the Republicans, they won't piss on me if I'm on fire, but at least they tell me that from the beginning. They don't like pretend to be on my side and pretend to have my best interest in mind, and then come to find out that they don't care about me at all. They just wanted to use me as a token, saying, see, look at my diverse friend. So I'm not nobody's token. And so the point in me sharing all of that is to say that, unfortunately, white supremacy culture is so inundated in everything that we do, from the way we have our households, to the way that we, learn things in school, to the way that we function with our friends and in society and everything. And, I think that our role, not just us on the panel, but everyone's role, is to sort of like, basically punch that in the face, get like, let it go. Like, don't be like, in your very best way, try not to be part of that whole society and structure. Cause I have a feeling that many of us in this room would not even fit into whatever box of, quote, perfection that they're trying to, I don't know, have in the world. And perfection is kind of weird to even try to get to, but I digress. The point is that, diversity is good, is a simple way of saying that. And I have found that working with disabled folks, myself included, has been incredibly rewarding for other people and other entities, not only to educate themselves on things to do and not to do, but also to just expand on their thinking. Like, sometimes I think some folks are very, very limited and closed off in the way they're thinking about their inclusion. Thinking that, oh yeah, I've got one Black friend, I'm good. No, you're not. There's more than just one Black friend in the world. There's multiples out there. And we should be, in my opinion, I think that we should want to meet more people who are different from ourselves, regardless of what that difference is. And that's one of the things I do at Diversity Includes Disability. And we go around and train people in a number of different places, a number of different areas, not just schools and corporate America and nonprofits. Everywhere involves and includes disability. And so every place should have some kind of disability inclusion training, because you never know when you're going to encounter someone, and you never know who is going to be in your life or not in your life. And because disability is not a monolith, they're not all the same. You want to make sure that you're getting all of the information so that you can support people in any which way that they need. So yeah, that's great. There was
that's awesome.
A lot of questions in the question, right. But I don't know.
Yeah. And then you have
so I gave some statistics, and some people aren't even aware that there are so many folks with disabilities in the world, beyond just the United States. And when I think about the inaccessibility in our country and in New York, I think about, oh snap, if this is not very accessible, then what the heck do I think is going on in other countries? And I read about the things going on around the world. And I've worked with folks in the UK, I've worked with folks in Ghana, Brazil, Mexico, and in Palestine. And they've all told me, like, yeah, we don't have anything. Like, y'all complain about inaccessible trains and buses and stuff. We don't even have a train or a bus. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, that's, first of all, first world problems. So hear me thinking, oh, it's so bad here. No, it's bad, but it's not as bad as some other places. But also, it builds more of a community between folks with different disabilities in different countries. And so anytime I'm talking to anyone in any of the countries that I mentioned, I do my best to connect them with whatever resources that I have come across in my 26 years working in the community. And that's one of the things that I wish more people did. Like, what is the use of having these resources and connections to important people if you're not going to share them? It does nothing if it's just in my head, nothing. And so I share everything with everyone, because why the heck not? And I think about just being, a poor Black and Palestinian girl from Jamaica, Queens, who had no access to anybody or anything. And now I have a ton of access. And I want to make sure that the folks who grew up in my hood aren't forgotten, but that goes for everyone in every hood everywhere. And so I just want to make sure that there's access, because there's so many resources. And oftentimes the higher ups act like there's not enough money. There's not enough support. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. There's enough support and resources for everyone. Unfortunately, folks just like to hoard the information, just like they like to hoard the resources. And I just want to share it with everyone. So, you know, I wish more people recognized that there were a lot more folks with disabilities in the world than there are. And I think, you know, now that COVID is here, and I don't think it's really going anywhere, there's going to be a lot more coming up with disability around long COVID and around whatever symptoms that come up with it. And I hope that our conversations about disability and about inclusion and equity and accessibility just gets better and comes from a place of being more educated about it, but also being more supportive about it, like making sure all new housing that's built is affordable and accessible. That is possible. Making sure that we educate doctors on how to speak to people and how to interact with people. That is possible. Making sure that schools are actually, you know, not just educating students, but supporting them and making sure that they're not being ignored because of their disability. So, you know, there's so many different ways that we can support people and be there for people, regardless of what their ability is. And I hope that, you know, I just hope things get better. That's my main concern. And I just want people to get whatever support and resources that they need to just live their lives. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's pop it over to Crystal. Crystal Lee, how are you doing? So here's a question for you. So you're an educator working in digital technologies and media. What is, you know, so we're gonna kind of pivot to these big objects like activism. Now we're gonna work on technology for a little bit, bioethics and policy. So artificial intelligence is a big thing, obviously. Like to learn more about what you think about responsible technology, including and beyond like issues of accessibility, and what's the interplay between responsible tech and disability justice, broadly speaking. And then I think also, how does responsible technology through a justice-informed framework impact or influence things like AI ethics, ethical tech, or public interest tech? And then the last question, so I want to know, like, what's at stake, right? So as artificial intelligence washes over our disabled bodies, which is doing constantly, how do you think disability justice influences AI training miles? And can one think about like cripping AI?
Okay, so I think my first slide tries to get at one of the first questions that you're talking about. So I like to think of my work broadly in the field of responsible technology. It's related to lots of other terms like ethical tech, AI ethics, public interest technology. And so what do I really mean by like this assemblage? Like really what I'm trying to think about are technologies and their interactions with structures of power. So, I mean, obviously a lot of these words get co-opted by corporations in like really interesting and horrifying ways. But when I'm talking about responsible tech in particular, really I'm talking about those interactions with structures of power. So in this work, I'm really interested in thinking about disability as method. So drawing on the scholars, Sami Schock and Julie Avril-Minich, I really like thinking about disability studies as a set of theoretical frameworks and concepts that we can use to think about the world. So in many ways, I think there's an interesting way to think about it to say that like one could be doing disability studies, but not studying disabled people. But you can also be studying disabled people and not be doing critical disability studies. So really it's about thinking and engaging with questions of normality, like who gets to be identified as normal or abnormal? What are these systems of norms and classifications, and what do they do with our bodies? And so using these set of tools, I like to help develop new information systems and thinking through new methods of pedagogy. So, for example, this is a screenshot of one of my colleagues, Daniel, who's blind, using one of our accessible charts. So in my role at MIT, I help develop more accessible data visualization systems. So the visualization on the top left corner has a heading, a scatter plot showing body mass and flipper lengths of penguins. And the scatter plot is sort of littered with blue, orange, and red points with a roughly positive linear correlation. And like the entire point of the system is that you can actually interact with it in multiple different ways, in multiple different modalities, either through a refreshable braille display, through a screen reader, but you can also interactively work with it so that you're not just reading data points like one by one, but like explore it in an interactive way that previous data visualization systems haven't necessarily allowed. And I also do some work on the intellectual history of human-computer interaction, so thinking a lot about the foundations of computer science and the ways that they've reflected ableist norms. But so to my work as an educator, I really try to think about what doing this kind of work in a curricular form looks like in a global context. And to that, I would love to continue talking with Iman about like thinking about disability in a global context, because a lot of the conversations around technology tend to have an incredibly Euro-American focus, like, you know, on GDPR, Section 230 as ways of thinking about models of tech governance, when in reality, this only represents a very tiny minority of users around the world. So what does this curricula look like in the global context? So it means that we're thinking about like mapping around the landscape around university structures, around syllabi, around tech ecosystems. And in the work that we're doing in Kenya and India, for example, we're thinking a lot about where the tech actually exists. So in Kenya, it's really impossible to make meaningful interventions if you're only thinking about the classroom, since so much of that work and the training happens in boot camps and innovation hubs than in traditional universities. And in a lot of this work, what we're really trying to do is creating locally resonant curricula that's important and speaks to the kinds of things that people are actually working with. Because, I mean, I think as important as cases on predictive policing in the US are, I don't think that they are necessarily the most appropriate curricula to be using as like the standard, since there are like such a wide range of issues that people are working on.
I mean, that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like police brutality on
Yeah.
one, and then the penguins on the other.
Yeah. I mean, you got to keep it light sometimes to kind of recover from these different forms of oppression. But so what does this kind of computing education really look like? So Casey Fiesler, a professor at CU Boulder, talks a lot about how she talks a lot about how certain syllabi content reflect certain biases, and often how a lot of this kind of education only happens, quote, if time allows, rather than as an integral part of this kind of education. At the same time, I think a lot of responsible computing education comes from a long history of scientific ethics, which I hope will kind of prime Laura's talk a little bit, especially in the work in the history of bioethics and like the aftermath of the Manhattan Project. But I think there are also a lot of pitfalls with doing this kind of responsible curricular work, because it's not just about talking about accessibility and disabled approaches to a technology, but thinking about the accessibility of the pedagogy itself. So like, do the teaching conditions that we're using in responsible computing curricula pass the vibe check, or are we individualizing the problem and setting up students to fail? Because a lot of times current curricula just simply doesn't address how to think about these issues in the workplace and beyond the classroom. At the same time, I'm really excited to talk more to both Lydia and Iman about like how this actually functions in advocacy and policy, because we could be making these intellectual arguments about why responsible computing or tech ethics are important, but sometimes at the end of the day you have to make these mercenary arguments about responsible tech skills. And I will say the ones that have been most compelling for me have been thinking about compliance and liability, which are really necessary but insufficient. And I would really welcome like additional perspectives from this panel to think about the future of technology and disability justice.
That's great. Thank you so much. So yeah, I like the pivot to the history of the Manhattan Project and the work it's done on American culture in particular, but also globally relative to bioethics. And I'm so glad you're here, Laura, coming from Cleveland Clinic. But it's not often in the disability studies space we have somebody from the medical health sciences at the table. And part that's due to a long, deep traumatic history and contested relationships between people with disabilities and biomedicine. That history is not a good one, to be sure. And so, do you think physicians and clinical care people have any sense of disability justice? Is there a way to somehow repair the deep trauma between like the history of disability and biomedicine? And then I'm also thinking about in my own work, how do theories in disability studies scale up into things like disability justice, environmental justice, and other kinds of justice-informed platforms? And so I like your question here about, when it comes to public health threats from global warming and like geopolitical conflict, how might healthcare systems and governments better prepare, to serve people with disabilities in ways that are more just and equitable and maybe even respectful at the same time? And I was also interested in, as a bioethicist, and maybe we can get into this a little bit later, what are your thoughts on genetic testing and gene editing? But we could take that up later.
Yeah. So I'm really honored to be here. Just to start with, I really appreciate the invitation. I look forward to the conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework of disability bioethics and related to emergency planning. So I am going to talk about the pandemic a bit, but it's because not just that I think it's, I still find it bizarre when people are like, we're post-pandemic, but also because of chronic disasters related to global warming and conflict. We have an opportunity to learn from the crisis of the pandemic to what we can do better for the future now, immediately. Yes, I would like that t-shirt. Awesome. All right. So if I talk about any cases or policies, these are issues of public record. And everything I do is deeply collaborative in this space. A lot of what I'm going to speak to is specifically thanks to Katie Savin. She's helped with my healing during and after everything related to 2020. So very grateful to her. So I often get asked about what a clinical ethicist is. This is not a common job track, so I hope you'll forgive my mentioning this quickly, but just to explain sort of my professional orientation towards these questions. So I'm a philosopher by training. And as a clinical ethicist, the job includes looking at policy review, whether that's within an institution, across a health system, for the state. I've worked on national guidelines. Also looking at like institutional committees related to, like I'm on an institutional committee that's dedicated to looking at treatment over objection in psychiatric units, for example, patient-facing information, ethical climate within a hospital. Do nurses feel empowered to, bring up ethical concerns and questions? Clinical education and mentorship, as well as academic teaching. A whole lot of my job relates to ethics consultation, though. So ethics consultation means that a patient, a family member, or any member of the healthcare team can ask for an ethics consult if there are questions or concerns about things that are happening bedside. And often they do scale up organizationally. So, ethical issues don't happen in a silo. So that's a lot of our investigative work as well as our supportive role.
Does that happen like oftentimes when you're a patient, the patient bill of rights is something that's presented and sometimes you sign on that, but is this idea of like you have access to bioethical consultation part of that?
Yeah. So it's not in the patient rights document that I've seen at any hospital, interestingly.
Right.
It's sort of like its own brochure and whether people tell you. So most of our consults come from healthcare professionals. I do wish we were consulted more by patients and families. I think people just don't know what we do, or, we don't bill like I want to say. Yeah.
So would your services hypothetically or actually be called in by a patient or family in a situation like, for example, where a member of a family has been brutally and severely wounded in an act of violence, and that person is on life support, and physicians have made a determination using the common language of this person is brain dead, and the family is in turmoil over as to whether or not to remove the person from life support. And if they're in conflict over, like, is this ethically permissible to do or not? What would this person have wanted? There is not an advance directive from the person as to their wishes in such a situation. Science is arguably not certain on what does it mean to be brain dead. Is that actually for sure something that happens? And maybe I'm not a neurologist, and maybe there is some line where a person's brain is literally not functioning at all. And then there's other scenarios where a person's brain is showing signs of activity, but it's unclear if that person will regain consciousness and externalized communicative abilities. And the family might seek an outside opinion on what are our options and what are the implications of them. Like, is that a situation where you might be called in?
So yes. Also, if there's like one of the 10 issues you mentioned, so that's a very complex case. Yes, that would pretty much automatically lead to an ethics consult at Cleveland Clinic. But yeah, anytime there's a question, if you have family disputing declaration of death, or if there are questions related to patient preferences or who should be the decision maker or best interests, all sorts of ethical issues that come up. So yes, thank you for that. So disability bioethics is a methodological approach to bioethics. I think of it like feminist bioethics. Black bioethics has also gained more steam in bioethical discourse. Disability bioethics, I think of it as having these core components, where it's a critical lens on dominant concepts and normative assumptions in bioethics and healthcare. So that includes issues of normality, that includes, what counts as healthy, problems of healthism. There are lots of fundamental concepts and assumptions that need that critical lens. A rejection of biomedical modeling. There's a lot to say there, but just, simplistic, reductionistic understandings of disability. The methodological primacy of the perspectives of disabled persons. I'll go back and forth between saying people with disabilities and disabled people, just to have respect for different perspectives on that debate. And so what this means is that if we talk about, say, the best interests of a child with Down syndrome, if there's not part of that discussion of first person perspectives of people with Down syndrome, then we have failed in that discussion. And yet a whole lot of bioethical literature and medical literature completely ignores the first person perspectives of disabled people. And of course, it's anti-ableist in aim and intention, very explicitly. So this is, I think, a fundamental approach to doing bioethics well. I don't think this is a niche field, or it ought not to be.
Right.
I think this is fundamental. And unfortunately, we know that bioethics training programs, clinical ethics training programs as well, do not routinely teach in this, right? If you do disability studies, it's niche, right? It's your specialization, which is frustrating. So I'm going to talk a bit about emergency planning. This slide is busy and complex. I apologize to that. I do have a full image description. to explain what I have here. So this is not an image created by me. This is from the National Academy of Medicine from a 2012 document they have on crisis standards of care. So you all probably heard the phrase crisis standard of care often, right, over the last few years, describe the pandemic. A lot of the conversation around crisis standards of care are actually underinformed or misleading. And so that's why I like to show this slide. So what you'll see here are 3 columns that describe different states of care. So on one side, you have conventional standards of care. So this is when hospital operations or healthcare operations generally are functioning like as normal as expected with the resources that we would consider within the range of normal, but we need to care for this patient population. As healthcare systems get more strained, so that means an increased demand and resource imbalance increases as risk of morbidity and mortality to the patients increase at a population level, right? So that could be within a particular region, that could be within a whole state, that could be across the country, it can be globally. But healthcare systems have to look at, are they moving into what are called contingency standards of care? And I'll say that something that I think is really unfortunate, and you see it in this document here, is that the National Academy of Medicine, back when it was called the Institute of Medicine, described this as functionally equivalent care, that people are trying to, MacGyver, if we at least, even if you haven't seen the show, I haven't seen the show, but we know what MacGyvering means. All right. So you're trying to do what you can to expand the resources you have for that straining system. So for example, you have nurses reusing PPE, even though it's supposed to be single use. It's not great. It's not ideal, right? But the thought is, well, we have enough, they would have their magic paper bags where they would put their PPE and have it sit there for 48 hours, and then they would use it after 48 hours, right? That they looked at using a ventilator for 2 patients instead of 1. Turns out that's horrendous. But, they would try to do things to maximize what they had. And so you had strains to the healthcare system that were not functioning at conventional levels. But the IOM/NAM called it functionally equivalent care. One of the lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic is absolutely not functionally equivalent care. There are vast inequities that emerge when we're in contingency standards of care, especially for multiply marginalized patients. So I could go on and on and on about that. Every time I read functionally equivalent care, I get mad. Crisis standards of care are when you have reached the nightmare point. You will often hear public health officials, bioethicists, medical professionals call crisis standards of care the nightmare. Nobody wants to hit that. So that's when you literally cannot, there's nothing you can do with your resources that would allow you to care for all the patients who need care, at least not in the same way. And so that's when you hit this triage protocol being activated. That requires a system. The government has to declare emergency. They have to authorize crisis standards of care for legal reasons as well as other professional reasons. As it turns out, during the pandemic, very few states actually enacted crisis standards of care. Even within states that the government technically allowed it, very few healthcare systems or hospitals activated their triage protocols. So I think this is a common misunderstanding. Everyone thinks that everyone was triaging everywhere. It was actually relatively rare in this country. Places like Italy, when it first hit, right, it made international news about the pretty brutal ways in which they were triaging because they hit crisis real quick.
But that's the moment where physicians prioritize some bodies over other bodies.
So when you hit crisis standards of care, the triage protocols do lay out considerations, and so it's multi-tiered of how you're going to prioritize some patients over others. Ideally, right, if these are done well, you don't have physicians at bedside making that call. You have triage teams instead of triage individuals, right? We evolved in our understanding and agreement as the pandemic went on. Ideally, you have triage teams who are following this protocol, double checking things like what the medical records are telling them. I got real scared when people started putting in algorithms in electronic health records to tell them how people should be triaged. Scared the bejesus out of me. But ideally, you have triage teams that are looking into a number of factors that they don't have certain information, right? So they don't have like the patient's payer source, their insurance status. They don't have their nationality. They don't have their race, and there are lots of problems with racial identifiers in medical records anyway, right? That they have information that's just relevant to like short-term survival with that particular intervention, say with a ventilator. With all that said, there's no triage system that's going to be perfect. It doesn't exist. There's no triage protocol that is not going to exacerbate inequities. I'm convinced of that at that point. There's still better and worse ways of doing it. But if we can avoid the nightmare, we absolutely have to avoid the nightmare. And this is one of the reasons why I'm going to be beating this drum like for years, even when people are like, we're past the pandemic. Why are you still talking about the pandemic? We're not past these issues. So, sorry, I'm trying to be succinct and I'm completely failing. So there are lots of different issues that can affect patient care too. So the focus on ventilators, I think, actually did a disservice to a lot of patients, including disabled people in the community, because shortage of ventilators ended up being far less of an issue than some of these things. So discharge and congregate care, right? Sending people back to nursing homes where they got sick and we expect them to die. And that leads to a disability justice concern generally about congregate care. Issues related to limiting hospital and facility visitors. So you had patients with like cognitive and intellectual disabilities who were especially vulnerable in a hospital struck with COVID that's already strained, and now they're not allowed to have their 24/7 caregiver. Right? Or you have patients with neurocognitive disorders who don't have people who know how to communicate with them available at bedside. Yes, issues with resource allocation. Pain meds became scarce in a lot of places, right? Before ventilators became scarce. Limiting CPR. So COVID can be aerosolized through CPR. So at what point can physicians unilaterally decide you have COVID, you're over the stage, or you have certain disabilities, DNR? There are lots of reports of patients with disabilities being pressured into agreeing to DNR as well. And nursing homes being told, write portable DNRs for all your residents. So this isn't like my being dystopic. This actually happened all around the country. Issues with patient isolation and quarantine, postponing elective procedures. Elective doesn't mean it's not medically needed, right? These aren't like purely cosmetic surgeries or something, right? These are like people getting follow-up for cancer. All right. So you all may be aware that there were many concerns about disability discrimination. So I'm going to veer more into disability rights space for a second. There are lots of important concerns about discrimination brought about a lot of triage protocols around the country. For example, Alabama's, I read it before they brought it down, openly said that people with intellectual disabilities would be excluded from critical resources when scarce in the state of Alabama. So when they hit crisis standards of care, they would be excluded, not just deprioritized, excluded. There are lots of different kind of concerns. Massachusetts, New York. New York, a concern there is that they would allow for personal ventilator reallocation. So Alice Wong has this really impactful piece in Vox where she wrote about being concerned that if she went to a hospital, they would commandeer her ventilator. I investigated it after reading her piece, and there were some reports in California and other places where triage protocols were just silent. So after I read that, I'm like, all right, I'm putting this explicitly in our triage protocols. We're not doing this. And leadership would say, we don't need to do that. We wouldn't do that. I'm like, no, we're going to explicitly have this and everything, right? Because we don't want to have that kind of concern. But something that I also started to get concerned about is informal triage. Informal triage is defined in different ways in different places. But what I mean by this is decisions to deprioritize certain patients or deny medical interventions due to concerns about current or potential scarcity that are not based in formal triage protocol or criteria. Right. So to get a bit to what you were talking about earlier, where you have like individual physicians deprioritizing bodies without going through the process that they're supposed to go through. And so there are some reports of this around the country. There are reports of this from France and Italy as well. The Michael Hickson case, if you're familiar with that, is potentially a case of informal triage where they are particularly eager to call feudal care. Yeah. So Michael Hickson is a Black man with quadriplegia. He also was blind. He had a number of impairments and disabilities that he had acquired as an adult. And he got COVID. He was brought to a hospital. They were in Texas. It was a complex guardianship situation. His wife was not his decision maker. An independent guardian was. And the physician, it was recorded by the wife, this conversation she had with him, where the physician said that he didn't want to escalate Mr. Hickson's care to include a ventilator, among other things. Because it was considered feudal treatment because of lack of quality of life. So he's explicitly making a quality of life judgment that led to not giving Mr. Hickson care that was the standard of care for what he was presenting with. And, you know, maybe it was just racism and ableism and a host of other things. I also wonder if informal triage was in the background, whether there was an especially poor judgment on the physician's part because of concern about potential scarcity. And I got asked this question a bit, like, at what point do we start saving up resources? Like, not a second until you're told to, right? Because of these kinds of concerns about how bias and inequity can enter into it otherwise. So disability justice requires proactive planning. And a lot of folks have said this, but just to dig in a little bit more concretely, that means expanding resources before the crisis. So that means staff, space, and supplies. There's been a lot of creative thinking in terms of regional support networks and load balancing of patients. And so like the hospital in a rural area that serves an underserved patient population that frequently has multi-marginalized patient populations, that hospital is going to sink first. Right? Not the fancy academic medical center 2 hours away. Right? And so there needs to be an agreement in that region about how to support patients. Partnering early and often with the community regarding public health information, health inequity, sites of vulnerability, and priority setting. And keeping an overhaul mindset where it makes sense. Again, from a disability justice perspective, when I think of disability justice, I think of overhauling oppressive systems and not being complicit. And this is especially urgent for groups who are going to be disproportionately impacted. An ongoing training of healthcare professionals has been mentioned by others and leaders regarding like biases in the system, as well as interpersonally related to racism, ableism, classism, and the fact that triage systems are not going to save them because they're all terrible in different ways. And that also leads to the next points of research into better triage systems for different kinds of public health emergencies. So the model we are using for COVID is the model we developed for H1N1. SOFA, the sequential organ failure assessment, it's not a good measurement. It's not a good metric. And everyone agrees with that. It can be especially bad for patients with disabilities. And so everyone recognizes that. And so we need to move beyond SOFA and do better for infectious diseases, but also for global warming. It's not going to help us. That's not going to help us at all. So when we think about global warming and conflict that are becoming more chronic and more severe over time, we need to do better. This is a QR code to a list of resources that Katie and I developed. If you're interested, that's also my email address.
Great.
Sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Normally, that's my problem.
Lydia XZ Brown,
Hello,
glad you're here.
I am here.
So, I mean, there's a lot to put on the table here, I think, to be sure. But maybe just getting into your thoughts on the political climate in the United States is remarkably divided. Geopolitics are violent, threatening, displacing, and killing the lives of many, as I think Laura is pointing to. At times, it feels like the entire planet is breaking down.
It literally
It's
is.
breaking down.
That is happening.
Are there, from your space, are there policy measures or ways of working that can help restore civil society and repair the respect for human rights through a disability justice framework? And how are you working on that?
So I want to bring the conversation back full
Yeah.
circle to the introduction that Iman was providing us with and add some additional clarification and grounding on the parameters of the conversation, because you're naming what is so important, and many disabled BIPOC, both within the borders of the so-called United States and beyond it, are calling attention to that disability justice has existed for a long time. Disability justice work has existed for a long time and largely occurs outside the realms of legal, political, and other resourced and power holding institutions. And at the same time, the specific framework of disability justice as we know it and name it now was co-created just under 20 years ago. You can tell I'm a humanities person because I just struggled to do basic math there. It was created between 2005 to 2006, which is just under 20 years ago, in coalition of a largely Black and brown and queer and trans group of disabled people. And some of those names, because naming our lineages is very important to do, are Patricia Byrne and Aurora Levins Morales, Eli Clare, Sebastian Margaret, Mia Mingus, Leroy Moore Jr. These are just a handful of the names. It was a much larger group of people, many of whom are still alive and organizing and creating cultural work and agitating today. And some of whom are no longer with us, like Stacey Park Milburn. The disability justice framework is predicated upon a foundational understanding that the tools, as many of us have described over and over again in all of the short talks you've heard, the tools of legal and policy change are necessary for improving the lives of people with disabilities in any given national, local, or multinational context. And yet, they are woefully insufficient, particularly in a context of liberatory work. The tools of law and policy, in other words, will not lead to freedom from settler colonialism, white supremacy, ableism, or patriarchy. And how can they when our laws, especially here in the seat of global power in the so-called United States, our legal system was built on and for the explicit purpose of justifying and legally entrenching a framework for rendering acceptable and ordinary genocide, land theft, and forced removal of Native and Indigenous nations across this land. That is the origins of our law. Like, I went to law school, and in property law class, which is mandatory for all first-year law students at any law school that's accredited within the United States, within 2 weeks, the case law that we were studying that provides the foundations and the outlines for the development of property law lineage and jurisprudential thought in the United States is rooted in colonial and feudal England. That's where our law is from. And asserting rights in property as understood by a wealth-privileged, land-owning Christian white man from England. Very specifically, right? And to say that our law could itself somehow imbue disability justice, I think, does a grave disservice to the origins and the roots of disability justice work. And the question that you pose as a provocation, what then might the relationship of disability justice be for legal advocacy or change at the political landscape, is a necessary one to consider in context, right? And specifically in the context of asking, if the law is tainted, then what? What can we do with such a tainted instrument? And this is where, in my work, again, I reinforce the necessity of using every tool and strategy that is at our disposal. When we are thinking about a liberated future, a future that is informed and guided by disability justice values and principles, that is a future that, as akin to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's description of abolition of police, prisons, and carceral systems as, quote, not a project of absence, but a project of presence, unquote. Disability justice then invites us to imagine what that liberated future is like. But moving to that liberated future requires not merely a change in and a radical transformation in societal and cultural values, but it also requires changes in material conditions immediately. And to fail or refuse to attend to the immediate material realities and concerns of those who are most impacted now within and beyond our borders is, as Iman was talking about in the very beginning of all of our conversations, to blatantly ignore that the specific problems that specific disabled people, whether or not they would ever use that word, which is a separate conversation, right, are experiencing are irrelevant. And that itself is a profoundly privileged and narrow-minded positionality to take up. The idea that therefore we should not engage. And so when I consider this question, I think about how disability justice values exist outside of law and polity, and yet legal and policy work can be undertaken with a move toward aligning legal and policy aims with disability justice values. Even if the law itself can never be a tool of disability justice, the law itself is not about disability justice. The law is certainly not about anti-racism or decolonization. But at the same time, we can strategically use and reshape how we engage with law or policy in order to call attention to grave harm. So some examples of how this has happened. Youth activists from largely Black and impoverished communities in Chicago drove activism that went straight to the floor of the United Nations General Assembly in demanding attention to the history and very recent history in large living memory of police in Chicago torturing, kidnapping, and disappearing Black residents in a secret torture facility. And activists in Chicago, again, largely Black youth activists, organized to demand that the city implement a reparations scheme that includes but extends beyond simply providing monetary recompense or compensation to individual victims and survivors of this police torture scandal, which I think the word scandal itself is also a minimizing word, but that's the word that's often used and deployed to describe years and years of systematic, targeted police violence, torture, and forced disappearance. They went to the United Nations floor of the General Assembly, and the campaign was called We Charge Genocide. This is an example of a campaign that was not explicitly about disability. It wasn't couched in the language either of disability rights or of disability justice in any explicit way, but ultimately was, at its core, profoundly about the intersection of disability and race, an intersection that Talila Lewis calls, quote, the most dangerous intersection that history has ever created, unquote. It was a campaign to call attention to the long-lasting, debilitating, and disabling impacts of police torture and mass criminalization of an entire community, the experience of collective trauma from this policing, as well as the individual experiences of physical and mental disability directly caused immediately or through long-term effects of such torture. And it was a campaign that at once leveraged the tools of an international human rights legal framework to demand attention to the call for reparations in response to the harms caused and endorsed by city officials in Chicago, and simultaneously called attention to justice-oriented work that exists beyond the bounds of what law or politics could hope to achieve. I share this as an example with you because in my own work, I've encountered criticisms from folks who are not equipped with the tools to think critically enough about the relationships between liberatory organizing, cultural work, and activism, and legal and policy-focused advocacy that in my work in the Washington, D.C. area is often referred to as the inside game versus the outside game. Are you playing the inside game or are you playing the outside game? And that criticism from folks who are very committed to only playing the inside game and won't ever consider the outside game is usually, well, you know, you can't be so militant and extreme, or no one will listen to you, no one will take you seriously. Everyone just thinks you're so angry all the time. I've heard this a million times, folks. I've heard this a million times. And it's highly racialized, it's highly gendered, and it's highly disability coded as well, right? And like I know for a fact that my non-disabled, white, cisgender, especially male colleagues do not get those same criticisms. They don't. And that is a reality that everyone who's in this room who isn't a cis white man has probably experienced at some point or another. And in every way in which we experience marginalization, those forms of delegitimization just become more common, right? As a rhetorical weapon to undermine our cause, to undermine our principles. But from the other end, a lot of people who are very devoted to playing the outside game, simultaneously, there can be this silent, pernicious accusation of you're colluding, you're more complicit than the rest of us, your work is tainted. Because if you ever engage in the inside game, you're morally compromised and your work is suspect immediately, no matter what version of the inside game it is. And in my work, as someone who has been at once in the trenches as a community organizer, and a lot of that work is not public facing and you can't find information about it online. Even if you look me up, you won't find most of that information. And I've also been someone who spent 15 years working in policy and on laws, right? Like I've heard both things. So it's really fun, sarcasm, to be simultaneously facing accusations that I am an insider who is so privileged and doing all these things that are so out of touch with real people having real problems because I'm compromised by working in law and policy. And simultaneously, I'm this extremist militant who's so scary and has fringe politics, will never be taken seriously because everyone thinks of me as an angry person who yells online. And I'm like, that's interesting and fun. And here's the reality. I am a person who works in law and policy. I am a person who's angry and yells online. I'm also a person who ran for state legislature last year because I believe in using and wielding every tool in our toolbox. There is not one tool or strategy alone that will miraculously get us to liberation. If we only focus on the inside game, we leave behind the people who are visioning what our future might be, what might be present in that future. If we only focus on the outside game and never engage with civil society, with human rights institutions, or with law and policy here within our own national and local context, then we're also leaving behind the people who are most impacted by those same systems at this time, right? If we think for the sake of moral, political, ideological purity politics, we're not going to engage with the clinical committees that Laura is working with. You know who we're leaving behind? The people who are worried, like Alice was, about her ventilator being requisitioned and taken away from her, leaving her to die. If we don't engage with the institutions that hold power, for profit and not for profit, then we ignore the critical work that Crystal and her colleagues are doing, that we allow tech companies to run rampant while trampling over the lived experiences of BIPOC, queer and trans immigrants and refugees and disabled and neurodivergent and sick and mad people. Because if we hold their feet to the fire and say, you need to put your funding where your mouth is, you have all this diversity pledge all over your website because you decided after 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, to performatively claim that you care about racial justice, you decided to performatively invite us to come during October for National Disability Employment Awareness Month and ask us to speak for free, by the way. You need to put your money where your mouth is. You need to put your policies where your mouth is. You need to be developing technologies, not just to retrofit for accessibility at the end of the day, but to think about the social and political and cultural conditions in which you are creating and then deploying those technologies. I don't really care if your facial recognition system is accessible to me, if you're selling it to the police and the military to use to further restrict movement across borders, surveil and harass protesters, chill dissent, and to further criminalize already hyper-criminalized communities. I don't really care that it's accessible or that you hosted an awards night to honor diversity leaders, right? Like, I don't care. But at the same time, if we're not in those rooms talking to those funders, advocating and agitating with those companies while our people are protesting outside, not instead of, but while, then we are losing valuable opportunities at the very least for harm reduction. If we refuse to engage, right, then we are losing already. And that's not to say that every individual person committed to a struggle or belonging to a particular community has to bear this burden as if it's their individual responsibility to be all things and to do all things, because it's certainly not. But that's why disability justice as a framework places so much power on interdependence, on collective liberation, on community, cross-community solidarity, because at the community level, we absolutely do have the capacity for folks to be working in all of these venues and in all of these strategies. Not at the individual level, but at the community level, we do. And so when I think about the issues, that you're raising, you're framing for us, right? We are living in a time of accelerated and extremely overt, hyper Christo-fascist white supremacy. That's what we are dealing with. It's not just eugenicists, it's eugenics that drives Christo-fascist white supremacist values. And that phrase is really important, right? Because it's not just about whiteness. It's not just about Christianity, because whiteness and Christianity in and of themselves are just specific experiences. Whiteness is a specific social cultural location. Christianity is a set of religious beliefs in a whole wide variety of diverse cultures and practices. But Christo-fascist white supremacy is an ideology rooted in global imperialism and settler colonialism. That's what it comes from. And so when folks say things like, vote like your life depends on it because it does, they mean it. They mean it. And I say, as an organizer, voting will never liberate us. Our electeds are not going to free us. I ran for office. Our electeds are not going to free us. Electing the most progressive people possible will not free us, will not disappear or decolonize this illegitimate colonial nation. And at the same time, when we vote, as so many have said before me, we are voting not necessarily for individual candidates or policies. We're voting for the conditions we're organizing under. Because as organizers, we will be organizing no matter what. As advocates for social justice, whether in a human or civil rights framework or outside of those institutions altogether, we will be advocating no matter what. My advocacy will not stop depending on who is elected and whether they are a hyper-Trumpian figure or whether they are the most leftward person that could possibly be elected within this country. I will still be advocating. I will still be organizing. Many of you will be too. So when we vote, we are not voting because we think it's going to free us. When we pursue litigation, we're not pursuing litigation because we think it will save us. We are doing this because it affects the material conditions under which we do our work and under which we live.
Lydia Brown.
I could keep talking about this for a really long time, but
Let's go.
I think I shouldn't.
Let's move into the interdependent space a little bit. Like what are some of your comments, thoughts, responses, questions that any of you might have? And are there any things on your end, Darian, okay. So we spread the deck, right? 4 very different domain areas, all working on disability justice from different angles, but I think a commonly held ethos, right? A commonly held set of values and maybe approaches, different approaches, but common values.
You're allowed to ask questions, but you also don't have to ask
Yeah.
questions.
Yes.
Wait for the microphone.
Hi, my name is Martha, and thanks for that. I'm a person who has done research on earthquake and other kinds of environmental hazards. So I'm really, really worried about things like the continuing wildfires and even people far away impacted by smoke. And when I see increased flooding and people being trapped in basement apartments and dying because they couldn't swim, they couldn't get out, they had mobility issues, whatever the issue was. And beyond that, then it's things like mold that somebody won't see right away, and it has all these bad health impacts. Are there situations or places that you know of where, in trying to do the better preparedness, various kinds of emergency plans are starting to take those into account? I just have to frankly say I haven't run into them like a city or a county or a public health department anywhere at all.
Can I note two things? And then I think Laura and Iman are like jumping at the bit as well. One, there are some cities or localities, I'm using the wrong terms now, that in which there's very engaged work by disabled people, including disabled BIPOC, specifically, not just disabled white folks with other forms of privilege, to implement plans within their cities that are informed by disabled people's perspectives. So like one great example of this is in Massachusetts. The Department of Public Health has a disability and health partnership, which is fully staffed. There is a director level position that runs that initiative. And it also coordinates with the Office of Health Equity, which was established by legislatively a few years ago in the state. And the director of that office has always been a disabled person and someone who's always had a disability activism background. So that was Nasra Nicola at one point, and now it's Rachel Tannenhouse, I think. And it's also a community-led effort in addition to a staffed one. There's also an organization called the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies that is co-led by two disabled activists, Herman Parodi and Shaylin Slizalis. I can tell you how to spell that later. And they've been engaged both within the US and beyond the US in response to mass acts of violence, war, and displacement, as well as natural disasters. And so like they are definitely folks that I would look to for further information.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so there's what I think of as the positive notes that Lydia just made, that there are people doing this work. I would also say the sad part of it is that there are states that don't have any organization around this, or that they have some very notable gaps. Pardon me. So in California, for example, yeah, I'm good. So in California, we know that the wildfires, for example, have severely threatened a lot of elderly people, disabled people, and poor neighborhoods where there have not been proper disaster responses at all. There have been nursing homes that have just been abandoned, right? So they know wildfires are in the area. The staff flee without the residents. There's not plan in place, or if there is a plan, it's a not good one, is what I'll say with the microphone in my hand. So, there's definitely better work to be done. I'll also mention that Julia Welcher has a website with podcasts where lots of great conversations with local organizers. Oh, that's amazing. With like conversations with disability organizers around climate change / global warming. Climate change is its own interesting term. I'm going to call it global warming and environmental justice work. So I do think that there's a lot of beautiful, important work to be done at the intersection of environmental justice and disability justice.
I absolutely agree with that. When I was still working for New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, we worked specifically with the MTA about improving their emergency preparedness plan for folks with disabilities, because before we mentioned it, they were like, emergency plan, we just YOLO about it. And it's like, wait, what? Oh, so we had to basically force them, but not just with paratransit, but also on the buses and the trains, and also in all of their buildings and their headquarters. So that was a bit of a challenge, but we got that done. And then further than that, so you can look that up with New York Lawyers for the Public Interest around the plan that we put in place with the MTA for disabled customers. And then once I wasn't at NILPE anymore and moved on to work with independent living centers, I discovered that as a city in New York, we didn't really have a plan in place for our nearly 2 million disabled people living there. So I put together a whole plan with City Hall about how we can support folks with disabilities. And what we did was go basically comb the local areas in every borough to find churches and synagogues and mosques and community centers, reached out to all of them, let them know that we are there to support folks with disabilities, regardless of the disability, and set up a sort of like a community plan so that we could support each other. So making sure that we had access to the food banks, making sure we had access to schools, making sure we also had access to medical folks in case someone had an emergency or needed something more than we could provide. So the plans, unfortunately, aren't coming from, city government per se, but they are coming from small and medium organizations and businesses and entities in the neighborhood. So my suggestion to you would be reach out to some of the whatever local organizations there are, and put together like a list of people that you can call if you need whatever it is that you may need for whatever support. And, hopefully things will be, because that's what we had to do because there was nothing. And I was like, this is not okay. Okay, we need something. And so we came up with this plan. And unfortunately, when we had our storm a few weeks ago, we had to get in gear and make those phone calls and get people support and also get people out of flooded basements and flooded nursing homes in Brooklyn and in Queens. And, we were able to provide them with support to get them to places like in Manhattan. And we had to, basically co-opt a lot of buildings so that people didn't get flooded and potentially lose their lives. So it takes community work is the short answer. So.
Remy.
Thank you. If it's okay, I'm just going to kind of ask a question on behalf of some students who might or might not have zoomed in. But I think this touches on everybody's really amazing talks. And so this is sort of a question around safety, activism, and surveillance. And especially, students who are really interested in organizing. I think at the moment, the two key examples are organizing around Gaza and Palestine, but also trans issues and examples of people being doxxed, harassed, stalked, etc. And so I think it sort of touches on everybody's talk, and I'd be curious to know what advice you'd have, both working within and against institutions and the disability justice sense of things. So yeah, hopefully that question makes sense.
Hello, a person who is chronically online speaking, as well as someone who became accidentally internet famous when I was 17 years old, and also has been since then very, very public in my activism and organizing. Students and literally anybody else know already, you just know instinctually from your own life that we all have different levels of risk of speaking out in specific ways or about specific things, and everyone's in a different position. And so what I mean by that is people who are citizens are more protected than people who are on a visa. People who are on a visa are still more protected than people who lack status. People who come from whiteness and wealth and a family that supports and cares about them come with a lot more protection than people who either come from impoverishment and or are estranged from family, right? And all of these different factors might affect, does someone trust that their job will protect them, or will their job leave them vulnerable? Does someone trust their neighbors to look out for them, or are their neighbors hostile to them? Does someone have financial resources to be able to afford bare minimum things like food or access to medication, as well as mental health support that they generally rely upon if they have a disruption in their access to regular income, right? And so everyone's in a very different position with regard to a multitude of identities, experiences, and often changeable statuses, right? That being said, there is no one size fits all answer to what can or should you do to keep yourself safe. But I would recommend that if you are interested in or active with doing a lot of protesting or organizing protesting on literally anything, go to the NLG's website. There is an extensive guide on what your actual rights are and practices on keeping yourself safer. There's no such thing as being safe, but safer in regard to protests and demonstrations. And I can say that I'm part of the NLG's National Executive Board. So like I'm shouting out our resources. Yay. I don't know if anyone from the NLG is watching this, but if you are, take note. But another thing that I have thought about a lot and that I really regret not doing when I was 17 and became accidentally famous on the internet is that an older practice of people who've been on the internet longer than me was to never use your real name online. People used to do that, not use their real name, not put in their profile a description that tells strangers everything about your ethnicity, your sexuality, where you are, how old you are, which is not to say never talk about those things. But today's internet culture, which was actually driven on by large data brokers selling our data for capitalism, has promoted this idea that the internet is more genuine if we all use our real names and all have all of our information findable. But the older internet wasn't like that. The etiquette was to never use your real name. And even in the history of the autistic activism movement, many pioneering autistic activists widely published their work and are known publicly by names that are not their legal name and may not be the name that people in their everyday life outside of activism call them by. And so one example of that, of a person who is now deceased, so this is public information, was an activist who widely published about autism and neurodiversity under the name Donna Williams. Her actual name, and I don't mean this in a dead naming way, the name she actually went by in her life with her loved ones was Polly Samuels. And it was also her legal name. But in all of her activism work, she was Donna Williams. And I just point this out as an example that if you are a younger person, and younger can mean age, but can also mean experience, and you are looking to become involved, but you're concerned about potential repercussions, one easier way to preemptively protect yourself, even if you're speaking out publicly, going to marches, being part of an organization, is to consider just using another name. Use a variation of a name that's important to you. Use a middle name. Use a grandparent's name, someone that you hold dear, a dead relative's name that you really looked up to. Use another name. And that doesn't mean you can never use your given name or your legal name ever, but it gives you the opportunity to delay that, to delay making that decision until if and when you want to merge your personas of the person who is deeply involved in activism and organizing and what your legal name might be. I really do encourage doing that. But the other thing to be aware of is to take stock of what your actual risk status is. What are the factors that impact your risk status? What are you legitimately worried about? And then therefore make decisions based upon that calculus. Like if you are worried about being kicked out of school, then perhaps you might be in a place where you want to only engage in activism that's far from school and not in public, or wait until you're done. And that can feel really shitty and awful, but it's surviving to fight another day in another forum. Or if what you're worried about is your family disowning you, then maybe it's just making sure that you engage in ways and perhaps using a different version of your name where it's not going to get back to your family, or it's very, very, very unlikely to get back to family. If you're worried about losing status, right, then it might be that you just don't want to go to a public demonstration where police are trying to get pictures of everyone. But if you go, wear a mask. It protects you from COVID, but it also protects you from facial recognition technology at the same time. Also, it provides a small amount of protection from pepper spray, not like a lot, but a small amount, and tear gas. But, you can also consider, for example, what disability justice activists have been saying forever about multiple strategies. There's a great living document originally published in 2014 and updated in 2020 called 26 Ways to Be in the Struggle Beyond the Streets, available for free online, that talks about 26 specific ways to agitate for justice and liberation other than public protests, marches, and demonstrations, which is not to downplay the importance or the need of public protest, but to uplift that many forms of activist work that are often dismissed because of gendered, classed, racialized, and ableist reasons are equally as necessary, vital, and important. And so there are many ways in which a person can become engaged and participate. And there are many considerations that you can factor in, and with conversation and with educating yourself about what your legal rights might be, what the legal implications might be, what are your rights as an employee on the job, what kind of allyship might you get. Like if you have a union job and your union is generally on your side, right, then you've got a lot more protection than someone who's not in a unionized job, or someone that's only in a temporary position anyway. And like, it's important for you to know that, because if you are in a position where you're more protected and have access to more resources, then you can, but do not have to, take more risks. And if you're a person who's at much greater risk of losing status, losing a job, losing income, etc., then know that you absolutely do not have to take any risk that would jeopardize those things. But also, if you feel in your heart, this is what I feel called to do, even though it might jeopardize those things, then go forth. I would say and prosper, but I think that's the incorrect phrase in this moment. And so autistic echolaling is failing me at this time.
So we have to close it out.
Oh no, I talked too much.
Onwards. Lydia, Laura, Crystal, Iman, thank you so much. Thanks for being here today. Really appreciate it. And thank you for all of you for joining us.